to manage successful end-of-unit for the oral communication classroom. This is presented by Daniel Newbury. I'm Simon Wright from Cambridge University Press, and I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleague Eve Lloyd. This webinar is part of a series of academic webinars running between the 30th of October and the 2nd of November. During the webinar today, you'll be able to hear our speaker and to see his slides, but you won't be able to see Daniel himself. You won't need a microphone, and if you want to ask a question at the end of the session, please write it in the chat box, and I'll make sure we put questions to Daniel at the end. A recording of today's webinar will be on the conference registration page a week or so after the webinar has taken place, and the register button will be replaced with a watch again button. Okay, just some background about our speaker today. Daniel is an associate professor at Fuji University and teaches adjunctly at Iwate University in Iwate Prefecture, Japan. He teaches primarily general, business and EGAP classes. His research interests are integrating technology with language learning and designing tasks that balance students' attention on fluency and accuracy. So, over to you, Daniel.
Thank you for the introduction, Simon. And I want to begin the webinar by putting end-of-unit tasks in the larger oral communication learning context with some observations made by Philip Kerr in his paper, How Much Time Should We Give to Speaking Practice? In this paper, he talks about end-of-unit tasks as the activity in which students can interconnect the language studied in the unit, and they offer perhaps the best opportunity for language review in a holistic sense. He goes on to say that without these tasks, we may not know if real learning has taken place in the sense that the students can actually use the language. So I think most teachers can see the potential value to the language learning process offered by these activities. But as Kerr points out, these tasks are still largely underutilized for a variety of reasons. And I can tell you in my experience that without proper guidance in these tasks, students often don't perform at their best. Specific problems include language learned in the unit is not actually used, and oftentimes the content seems unfocused. So some of the activities that I'm going to talk about today, I hope help remedy these problems. So first, I'm going to talk about end-of-unit tasks and what are they to us as teachers. Next, I'm going to talk about what scaffolding is in the end-of-unit task context. And then I'm going to talk about specific task management techniques. So first, I want to talk about what are end-of-unit tasks. And the most obvious answer is they are the presentations, poster sessions, debates, discussions, surveys, and any combination of these that are found at the end of units. And I want to talk more, more specifically about what are end-of-unit tasks to us as teachers. And end-of-unit tasks to us as teachers are a set of interrelated processes. Some of them are language focused, but often they are not language focused, and we as teachers need to be prepared to deal with both kinds of processes as we go in and teach these end-of-unit tasks, and that can sometimes be difficult. And I want to break these tasks down into their fundamental elements so that we can address where we may have problems. Specifically content, or what are the students going to say, language, and how are they going to say it in the target language. And then, especially in the EAP context, critical thinking element, and often these are assessing a problem or taking a side in a discussion, and often these are a combination of elements, often that are found inside of the tasks. So it is my experience in the EFL context that if students are allowed, or not allowed, but if they are left to their own devices, they tend to focus on one of these in a disproportionate sense, and in my experience, it has been the content. And so as a EFL teacher, I do want to keep the students focused on the language. And so a lot of the activities, or the activities that I'm going to talk about today, are meant to do such. So the way I do this is through scaffolding in an end of unit, in scaffolding in the end of unit tasks. And specifically in scaffolding in this context is, of course, it takes the traditional definition of supporting learners and achieving lessons aims that would otherwise be impossible. But I want to broaden this definition to include clearly defining learning expectations and define book teaching, speaking. This is talked about quite a bit. And I want to relate it to end of unit tasks in that prior research has shown that if we do not actually, I guess, specifically focus our students on including language learned in the units in their output, especially in end of unit tasks, they tend not to include it. So as human beings, more than learners, we tend to stick with what we know. And so students oftentimes will just stay with what they know works without exploring and getting into end of unit or getting this language into their end of unit task output. So we have to scaffold them into this process. And so some of the techniques that I'm going to show you to do that today are effective use of discussion questions, and this assists us, or this assists the students in priming that target language that we want them to use. End of unit task templates. This is an extension. This is a very similar thing, but it's an area of consolidation where we can consolidate the target language from the unit and show it all to the students at one time so they know what is expected to be used. Post-performance task checklist, and I'll talk some more about that. And then decision making and content generation. The first three of these are language focused, and the last one is more content generation focused, and those are just going to be some things that I do generally when getting students prepared to use content. It is worth noting that these don't have to be used all together. You can use them one at a time, but I tend to use them all together, especially the first three. So I do want to talk about discussion questions. Discussion questions are very useful in priming language, first of all, because they're low risk for the students. Oftentimes, end of unit tasks represent an assessment environment. Even if we aren't using them specifically for assessment, the students feel the pressure of assessment, and so discussion questions take that pressure off. Also, students will have prior experience with discussion questions in their L1, and specifically I'm talking about turn taking and just basic fundamental discussing that kind of is not related to any specific language, whereas presenting and debating will be more socially anchored. And finally, they're adaptable. The discussion questions don't have to be related topic-wise to the actual end of unit task, and so we can take any kind of discussion question, we can actually even make our own if we want, and apply our language that we want the students to use inside of those discussion questions so that the language has been primed for them to use in the end of unit task. And I'll show you a little bit of what I'm talking about from now. Oops, sorry, I jumped a slide. Okay, so this is a very basic discussion question scaffolding technique that I use online in class. All this is just making word minimums for the students, in having them include some of the language that I do expect them to use in the end of unit task. And this is quite useful, I think, for higher level students, and by higher level I'm going to talk in the B range for the CEFR. And I find that it can be a little bit confusing for lower level students, and so I want to show you another technique that comes from eltcation.wordpress.com. The link is right there. And this has actually proved to be a very effective method that I found for me. And it not only does it help the students incorporate the language that we do want them to use, but it also adds a sense of coherency to their output. And we can also infuse some interaction prompts for them. And I'll kind of move on to show you a sample from a class that I taught probably about 3 weeks ago on presenting, and this is an agreement disagreement. It's actually the final task is a presentation, but as you can see, the student has made use of this particular discussion question form. And what I did in this case is I had the students take this form that I made home, they filled it out, memorized it, and came back the next session ready to discuss. And they were able to hold some very coherent discussions using this. The next slide that I'm going to show you is the same type of activity, but I want to show you this slide. This was actually done by a co-teacher of mine in another class, and this is for presenting a picture. And I want to show you this just to show the versatility of this kind of technique. So you can use this both in focusing on, for example, discussion debates, or in giving a description. And he said that was quite useful for him. So I want to finish up with that. So we can use discussion questions to get the students ready to use the language, and I want to move on to templates. And by templates, I mean menu-style language consolidation. So what we're using templates for is I'm creating a document that the students, that includes all the language from the unit, and the students can go through and pick which language that they want to use and add their information to the end of it. So it kind of puts all their information right on one page. These are quite useful because they assist with group work. Oftentimes with end-of-unit tasks, when I'm preparing for them, I do put students together, and it helps them gives them a frame of reference when they're working through these end-of-unit tasks, and they're able to focus, for example, on part 2. They'll all go to part 2 together, so it does make this process more efficient. And finally, it's managed complexity, and I'm going to explain this a little bit more because it is an important part of the end-of-unit task creation, or I guess getting ready process. And in this, I will reference Robinson's complexity framework, and some things that I often try to manage is preparation time. So by this, I mean that higher level students are given less preparation time, whereas lower level students, we can give them more time to prepare. Task elements. So as you just saw with the discussion, I guess, template that I just showed you, we can add and take away task elements to manage the complexity of the overall task. And using the template when performing the task, I do want to explain this a little bit. When I'm working with lower level students, I tend to give them the opportunity to hold the piece of paper in their hand without actually reading it. But it's kind of psychological. If we allow students to have something that they can refer to when they are in the midst of doing the end of unit performance, it does comfort them, and they are able to do a better job, I feel. Whereas higher level students may not need this kind of support. So here's an example. It's a little bit fuzzy here. I'll show you the next picture. I'll show you will be a little bit more clear, and it's actually one that a student used. And so as you can see, the student used this over on the left-hand side. You can see the language that I pulled from the unit, and the student has gone through and used the template. This is the first part, and then the second part is here. But the student was able to use this, prepare for in this case, it was a presentation. And this student actually did not use the template in the presentation, and they were able to give quite a good presentation, I thought. I also want to show that you can use this kind of template for debates as well, debates discussions. And the debates discussions, of course, are a little bit more complex in the interaction side, but you can use this kind of idea for supporting debates, as I'm actually doing right now this week, using a template to support the debate. Okay, so that's the second idea that I wanted to show you. Next, I want to show post-performance checklists, and this is a little bit of a misnaming because I usually tend to give these post-performance checklists that I'll show you out with the templates. And what this does is it connects the pre and post task, and by that I mean the students are able to see what they're going to be responsible for going into the task, and so they know what to focus on throughout the preparation for the task. It's also student-created content. I do often audio record students, or I have them audio record themselves and upload those audio recordings into a share software. And so students will use a checklist to listen to one another, and they will listen while looking at the checklist to make sure that the person that they are listening to has indeed included the language and covered that area of content within the end of unit task. Also supports listening for details. Of course, not all tasks are presentation style. We want to also focus on input and listening in the task, and so these support making sure that the students are listening for information as opposed to just speaking. And I'll give you a sample of that. Again, this is a little bit difficult to see, but as you can see, it is just a regular checklist, and the students can go through these checklists, make sure that their partner in this case has used the language, and then they'll make a very small note of the content of that specific language form off to the right there. And I will show this in action. As you can see here, the student did use the language. They did circle it, so they showed specifically what language was used, and off to the right you can see that they made comments about what was talked about. So this does promote not only inclusion of the language, but also active listening. So that's going to finish up my focus on language. You do want to begin, or I tend to begin focusing early on language through discussion questions. I also like to show the students their choices that they have in the language that they can use through the templates. And then I do set expectations and promote active listening with checklists. So the next section I want to talk about is decisions and content creation, and specifically decision management, and this refers to any decisions that the students will make. For example, if it's a presentation, what am I going to present about? If it's discussion or debate, which side am I going to take on that? And then content or information management, and this is the content building. And as I told you a little bit earlier, I have noticed that students do tend to dwell in this component of the end of unit task when left to their own devices a little bit too long, and so I like to streamline this process, and I'll show you some ways. My general approach here is lower language ability. There's less decision making that goes into the task, and there's more content sharing. Specifically for the lower language ability, I do want to focus on the language, and for higher language ability, we give a little bit more leeway in that. More decisions can be made by the students, and so there is more independence in content building. And more with higher language ability students, or higher ability students, my focus is more on dispersing information that they're making, and so that they can share information, and I'll show you how I do that. So a tale of two tasks. What I want to show you here is this is a task taken from, it's the Prism book. I'm now using Prism. Have an informal debate about whether or not public money should be spent on public art. I want to show you what I would do for lower level students and then for higher level students. And so if I had a class of lower level students, I would actually provide them with statements that I've made or that I've pulled the information off the internet for the students to sort and use. I would create that content for them. I would limit the number of arguments down as kind of lower the complexity through the model that I showed you earlier. I'd make the template shorter, and then I would give them more preparation time. Again, this is based on our complexity framework that we have. And so for higher level students, I would allow them to create their own statements, and then I would provide them support in disseminating that information, and I will show you how I do that in the next slide. The template can be more complex and less preparation time is given for higher level students. So this is just some ideas that I would use to manage the successful outcome for this task. And so like I said, when I'm helping the students with sharing information, I make heavy use of internet form systems. What I'll do is I'll usually set up a series of forms for the students to fill in. They can use their smartphones when filling these forms in. And so you can see an example here from the example that I just showed you. Public money should not be spent on arts. This is for that side of the discussion. I would give this link to the students and then have them fill in their information of their idea. And as you can see, if you can read over here on the right, these are ideas that the students put in. And so what we can do here is we can support them in sharing their own information. I'm not having to build information for them, but it helps give them different ideas and it helps support their autonomy, really. And so I have found this to be highly successful with assisting students in building their own information out and then using the templates to create a successful end of unit task. And so I'm going to finish up here. I want some things I want to point out before I do finish. It's important to plan for language and task management. I do know that as language teachers, we do naturally focus on the language, but it is very important to be aware that we're not simply managing language in the end of unit tasks. We are also managing aspects such as time management and content management, and so we need to be aware of that going into those tasks. We need to set targets and expectations clearly. Given without any direction, the students don't know what to do. I do find that the higher level students can perform in that environment, but lower level students do need that direction. And I also know that early on in my teaching career, I thought, I don't want to be overbearing with the students, but actually they do appreciate it, really. So it does help to set expectations for them. They do appreciate it, I think. And so we do want to focus not only on language, but content for optimal results. And thank you very much for your time.
Great, thanks very much for that, Daniel. Today's webinar has been re-recordings due to technical issues, so you won't be able to hear the question and answer session that we usually have at the end here. There are, however, 7 other webinars in full which were recorded as part of the academic online conference. These are available to watch again at cambridge.org/academic-English. On this page you will find a link through to the conference page